special Q&A segment, we're joined by Sxwork activist Mistress May. May is a co-founder of Decrim 305 based in Miami, Florida, and is one of the organizers of Slut Walk Miami, a community-centered event created for sex workers by sex workers that's happening on December 14th. So May, would you mind telling us a little bit more about what folks can expect if they attend Slut Walk Miami?
So this is going to be our fifth annual Slut Walk. And so we started in 2020. And so you can expect it to probably be the biggest, baddest year that it's ever been. We've got some big folks in the adult industry joining us this year, which has never happened before. And so we have a lot of exciting things in the works. We're going to have a little bus. There's going to be accessibility options for folks that can't walk. So there's going to be art activities. It's going to be a really, really good time. This event is open to everyone. However, allies, please, sit back on this one. You can definitely attend, but, this is an event to uplift sex workers. So sex workers to the front.
So before we dive into today's Q&A, let's chat a little bit more in detail about decriminalization and your involvement in that movement. What do people refer to when they refer to decriminalization in the context of sex work?
There's four legislative models right now. There's criminalization, which we should all be familiar with. There's decriminalization, there's the Nordic model, there's legalization, of course. So yeah, those are the four legislative models. So when we talk about decrim specifically means that basically you can't be arrested for being a sex worker. And so under the criminalization model, the ways in which they identify you as a sex worker are either a sting, in which you're sort of entrapped, caught, if you will. Then there's things like, well, in a lot of states, condoms are used as evidence of prostitution. So decriminalization is basically saying, like, we can't arrest you just because you have a condom on you, just because you happen to look like a sex worker, like maybe the type of clothing that you're wearing. I think it's really important to remember it's its own legislative model. It's decriminalizing does not mean legalization. And the reason that sex workers advocate for decriminalization more over than other models is because it's the most beneficial for all forms of sex work and all people that exist in sex work. So like marginalized communities, such as migrant sex workers, are often affected by criminalization and experience harsh conditions. And so a lot of times when things happen to them on the job, say sexual assault, they can't report that crime because they're going to be arrested. So under decriminalization, that wouldn't happen. That would offer more support for a sex worker to be able to report a crime and potentially get resources like mental health resources, etc., for afterwards. And then decrim also allows you to have more protections. So you can potentially unionize. You could definitely unionize under legalization, but again, that only helps a certain group of people who are working legally. I don't think there's a model that will be like, the perfect model for everyone, but decrim is definitely the best model currently for sex workers.
It sounds like legalization and decriminalization are often conflated. So what's the biggest differentiating factor between the two?
Yeah, and this is really important, especially for the allies, because I see a lot of folks who are pro sex work. They're allies, and they've got a lot of energy too. They've got the right energy. They're just putting it into the wrong basket. Like I said earlier, decriminalization does not equate to legalizing. It's its own thing. So we should be familiar with legal models like OnlyFans, the adult industry, like the main porn industry, those would be examples of legal work, camming, etc., dancing in a club, for example. Legalization, what it basically does is it's essentially backdoor criminalization. A lot of sex workers refer to it as that, because it regulates the industry, which means that it also regulates your body and the services that you can provide. And then if you fall outside of those legal confines, for example, a migrant sex worker, then you're criminalized because you're not working within the parameters that were given to you by the government. So for example, in Nevada, there's actually really high rates of criminalization against prostitutes because a lot of folks in Vegas are not able to get a license to work legally in a brothel, for example. And so they end up working independently and they end up being criminalized. And so legalization is referred to as backdoor criminalization because of that. It's basically another way of saying, well, if you don't work this way, then you're going to jail. And so what Decrim does is say you don't need to work, you don't have to be regulated by these conditions. And we will let you as an independent worker regulate those services, but we will no longer spend tax dollars on arresting consensual adults. And instead, now that money can be reverted to resources or to actually stopping trafficking, and like literally just not arresting consenting adults.
It sounds like then also the decrim model you would have more autonomy over the work that you do versus having something regulated by the government or what have you, given parameters that you have to
Correct.
stay
Yeah.
within. Okay, which could potentially exclude a lot of people too, that are engaging
Yeah.
in this work. Okay.
I mean, we've seen with even like drugs in, marijuana being legalized versus criminalized, right? The difference between that is that you can definitely regulate a substance. You can't regulate a body.
Are certain groups more heavily impacted or targeted than others in terms of criminalization?
So like in Miami, we have a big migrant Latino community, but we equally have a big migrant Black community. We have a lot of Haitian migrants, a lot of people who come from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Venezuela, like who are looking to survive. I would say here in Miami, those are probably the most affected people. I think depending on where you are, the group would probably change, but generally, as a whole, BIPOC folks, trans folks, queer folks, they're all the most affected, and most certainly Black trans women are the most affected for sure.
Are there any successful models in other countries or perhaps even here in the US that have decriminalized sex work?
Yeah, so New Zealand is a great model. They do criminalize sex work. I can't remember how many years ago. Quite some time ago. And there are certain parts of Australia, so some parts are legalized, some parts are decriminalized. I would say New Zealand is probably the best model because it's been around the longest, and there's a lot of research that's been done in and out of New Zealand. I just finished a book actually. It's called Producing the Acceptable Sex Worker, and it's written by a New Zealand sex worker or former sex worker. And it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend. So, there have been challenges in New Zealand with decriminalization. I would say they're very manageable and very different from challenges that we face here in the US with criminalization. Like now they're advocating for anti-discrimination laws. So I guess they've been having issues with like sex workers still experiencing discrimination even though it's decriminalized. So I think it's important to remember that, even though decrim can improve things and it can certainly it can certainly turn the tide in a lot of ways. It's important to remember that we have to advocate for something beyond decrim. Like once we do get decrim, we have to like keep pushing for improving the lives and well-being of sex workers, right? Let's say we decriminalize Florida tomorrow. Whew, that would be a dream. Even if we did it tomorrow, there's still so much stigma that we have to combat that is in every facet of society. As great as New Zealand is, like, yeah, they're showing us that we have to continue to have that big picture and like think of something beyond decriminalization.
Whenever sex work was decriminalized in New Zealand, do you think that their culture had anything to do with that? Because obviously, like American culture and the culture in New Zealand might be much different, but do you think that played a role in your opinion?
I wouldn't dismiss it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't dismiss it. It could definitely be a factor. Like, we always talk about Europe being like not as taboo about sex. Maybe it's not as extreme as here, but it's still there.
In your view, then, what needs to happen or change in order to decriminalize sex work in the United States?
I definitely think we're going to get farther by doing it state by state. Federally recognizing sex work or like decriminalizing, I think it's a ways away. It's not impossible. I'm not gonna say it's impossible. It's definitely doable. I just think that it's a little while, and it's gonna take the momentum of seeing other people do it. New York is really close. I mean, they're right there. I feel like if New York does it, then that'll set a precedent for sure for maybe other progressive states.
So, how is your group Decrim 305 involved in the efforts to decriminalize sex work in the U.S.?
I think it's important to start smaller because it's a little bit more actionable. So we're essentially working on advocating on education. We meet with current politicians. We meet with politicians that are running. Um, just essentially creating a network of candidates that we can have a direct line to. So, for example, last year there was bipartisan support to um, amend the current laws for prostitution in Florida, or prostitution and trafficking because it's conflated. And they basically wanted to change the penalty from all misdemeanors to all felonies. And the reason that I found that out was because a politician that we were in direct contact with called my co-founder and was like, "Hey, this is hitting the floor. It's got a lot of support on it. So like, I don't know what you want to do." So then we ended up meeting with a representative out of Delray and spoke with her, consulted with her and her team. And then the amendment ended up dying. And it hasn't come back around.
Let's delve into more information then about how modern day sex work has been criminalized, the impacts of criminalization, and of course, how we can get involved to improve the lives of future generations of sex workers. This is not a comprehensive list, but we will be focusing on three key issues that have resulted in widespread impacts to those in the sex work and even the adult media communities. So we're going to start with the Nordic model. What is the Nordic model for those of us, especially in the United States, who are unfamiliar?
It has quite a few names. It's had to rebrand a lot. The Nordic model it's known as a quote unquote partial decriminalization. And they say partial decriminalization because it does not criminalize sex workers, but it criminalizes the buyer.
Okay.
So clients would be criminalized, right? And so it sounds like a good idea, but it's really not. How are we supposed to make our money if you're arresting the people who give us the money? And then, it also makes it more dangerous because, well, now clients don't want to screen. They don't want to show their ID. They don't want to provide a reference. They're like, well, I'm going to go to jail if I see you. So I don't want to like put myself out there.
Does this
Which
apply
is,
to in-person only then, or is this any form of sex work, essentially?
this is more for in-person sex workers directly. It doesn't really have the same level of impact on legal forms of sex work. So it really, I think, affects more people in person, but it's definitely not a good model. This is the model that is currently in New York. It's more dangerous than it is helpful. If anything, it's sex workers have criticized it and said that it's made the work more dangerous than criminalization. Because under criminalization, the sex worker is criminalized, not the buyer. You could charge the client with solicitation, but it's unlikely. But A lot of radical feminists or anti-trafficking orgs, they rebranded this model. This is the model that they love to push for, and I think it's really easy for allies to get confused by thinking that this is a good model. It's been rebranded as the equality model, the end demand model. It's known as the Swedish model because the first implementation of it was in Sweden. So there's quite a few names for it. And I just think if you have to keep rebranding, it's probably not a good product.
When it has been rebranded, has anything changed about it?
Just the name, just to make it a little bit more nice on the ear. For ending the demand for sex work by criminalizing the buyer. It does not offer exit services, resources, mutual aid. It doesn't offer you resources to other legal forms of sex work.
The expectation was that it would maybe quell sex work in general by prohibiting people to essentially buy services. But in reality, what has happened, particularly to sex workers because of it?
Because of it, sex workers are not making money, and
Okay.
they're experiencing increased violence on the job.
Because they're not able to screen as they typically would. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move into FOSTA SESTA. I think especially the online community should be aware of this. FOSTA, or the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and SESTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. Can you explain what that is? And then also the expectation of this legislation versus the reality of it.
So these concurrent bills were introduced in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
and it had bipartisan support. I want to say whenever there's something anti-trafficking, there's always bipartisan support because
Yeah.
who isn't against it? So I think it's quote unquote well intentioned, essentially making it harder for traffickers to exist online to quell trafficking from happening. Instead, what's happened is that it's made things harder for sex workers. It really has not been effective, and there's been quite a lot of research actually on the effects of Sesta Fosta, and how it hasn't helped. And Sesta Fosta is really eating away at Section 230, which has to deal with the ways in which the internet is specifically regulated.
I believe this just kind of offloaded the responsibility onto the platforms to patrol the content that's being uploaded to their sites, because otherwise they would be liable.
A lot of people talk about that, with regulating the internet, and I think what a lot of people fail to understand is that the internet is a tool. So you need a bit of literacy on how to use that tool.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
of bad actors who are utilizing the tool of the internet in ways that
precisely.
are harmful to others. So let's move into age verification then, which is it's a big one, as are the other ones, but I feel like this one is particularly relevant to right now. What are age verification laws? And again, like the expectation of what these are supposed to do versus the reality of what they have done thus far.
Age verification is definitely a big one right now. And some places have introduced it, like in Texas, and they've implemented it here in Florida too. Basically, age verification laws, packaged as, we want to make the internet safe for children. Um, and this is when we start to get into some murky water. They end up invading your privacy in a major way. Um, it ends up being really easy to bypass the verification. It doesn't really make it any safer.
What happens when, for instance, like a user is trying to access an adult website? Can you explain what that looks like under a state that has enacted an age verification law?
Well, a lot of these new age verification laws that are asking you for your ID to go off. which, a lot of people are not doing that. And they're getting VPNs in order to access these things.
Some of the advocates from the adult industry have also argued that, like, versus, having to provide an ID, which is like a huge invasion of privacy and not to mention a potential security issue, they're also arguing that maybe on a device level, like I have a Gen Zer, I have a teen child, and we use iPhones. Whenever I set up their phone through Apple, I had to input their actual age under, like, the parent of the family umbrella. And so I guess the adult industry in particular has argued that, why don't you, instead of, going the photo ID route and putting all of this liability on these companies, on these platforms, instead to put it back on a device level. What are actionable steps that we can take, both as members of the impacted communities and supporters or allies, to advocate for and improve the lives of sex workers?
Yeah. I think the most actionable and realistic is, number one, listen to us. Listen to sex workers. Everybody says that they're pro sex work and, they're an ally. But then as soon as we express our experience or one of our opinions, from being in this line of work, we're dismissed, we're talked over, we're overlooked. And I think it's important to remember, it's for everybody to remember that the opinions of sex workers who are being affected by the industry they're trying to navigate, their opinion supersedes a non-sex worker who's not in the industry, who's not having those same struggles of navigating, trying to survive in a criminalized industry. Like, don't speak over me as a sex worker on sex worker rights. It starts with that.
For people maybe who they don't have sex workers in their life, or so they know about anyways, do you have any resources or recommendations where
Yeah.
people could go for just more information if they just want to learn?
In 2024, there is more media representation of sex workers by sex workers than there's ever been before. So I would say, not every piece of media involving sex work is good media. I'm a big media person. I love storytelling and hearing different perspectives. So I'm always in a book or watching something. Revolting Prostitutes, I've got it right here. That Pornhub documentary on Netflix is a great, honestly, like, I know that it received some criticisms, and like, I think that it's a great documentary in terms of like understanding stuff. It really explains everything very well. I think the third thing I would say is like, investigate the source. I think that finding the reliable sources is really important. Make sure it's not an anti-sex workers perspective. You just hate sex workers at that point. You need something with like a neutral perspective, and that gives you the facts, and that isn't giving you like an opinion.
Do you have any final thoughts about decriminalization, especially, and really just the state of things for sex workers at this moment in time?
Going into the 5th year of Slutwalk, I feel really good about the state of things. There is plenty of work to do, and there's, the government's keeping us busy in terms of advocacy. So it can be daunting and challenging. Like, what a time to be alive. We're seeing more slut walks than ever. We're seeing the conversation of decrim as broad as ever. I can open up TikTok and see a video about it. I think it's just an exciting time of history, really. Like, we're really witnessing a big change. Like, we are on the precipice of really being recognized for these issues. I recognize, I mean, like, society really having an eye on us and being like, wow, this is a movement. So, as grim as things can be, and I think that, things can be pretty grim. I think it's important to remember that from the time Carol Lee coined the term sex work in the late 1970s to now, a lot's happened, and a lot of good. And so I think that's important to remember because sometimes you get like a little bit stuck in the day to day and you're
Yeah.
like, am I really changing things here? I think I think when Carol Lee passed away in 2022, I think she was proud of how far we've come.
I think just this community too, and just really the resilience that we've seen, it's really, really inspiring, even for people who are just not engaged in this space at all. So there's still a lot of good happening at the same time. Where can people go if they want to learn more about Decrim 305 and also if they're interested in learning more about Slut Walk as well, coming up in December?
Instagram and Twitter, and it's Decrim 305.